Now we're going to learn about a machine learning supervised technique called K-nearest neighbors. K-nearest neighbors is a non-parametric machine learning method. It's non-parametric because unlike the other methods we've learned about, namely linear regression and logistic regression, where you're learning parameters, namely the m and the b of the mx plus b, in K-nearest neighbors, there's no learning of parameters. None of that's involved. In fact, there's no gradient descent or like learning of parameters through a process like gradient descent involved. So because of that, it could be a very fast algorithm to train. So let's learn about how K-nearest neighbors work, and let's learn about it through an example. So let's say we're trying to classify the type of a bird. So we have two different bird species. They do this a lot in biology. And let's say we have two data points about a bunch of birds. We have their beak length, which we plot on the x1 axis, and their wingspan, which we plot on the x2 axis. And we plot all of bird type A's as circles, and we plot all of bird type B's as squares. So in K-nearest neighbors, essentially what we do is we just record all the data, and that's the training. There's nothing else involved besides just recording the data. Then to predict, let's say we have a new bird and we measure its beak length to be here and its wingspan to be here, so it falls under this question mark. Then we can use, we could essentially look at the nearest neighbors to that question mark, the nearest data points, and based on how many of whatever the majority of the nearest data points are, that's what we classify as. What matters a lot here is what we specify K to be. So in K-nearest neighbors, even though it's called a non-parametric method, technically the K is a parameter, but it's not a learned parameter, so that's the distinction. So if we set K to be, let's say 3, so 3 nearest neighbors, then for this question mark, we see that the 3 nearest neighbors, 2 of them are circles, 1 of them is a square. So if we were doing 3 nearest neighbors classification, we would classify this unknown question mark bird as bird type A. It's important to note, though, that let's say that we were doing 1 nearest neighbor. We set K to 1. In that case, the closest neighbor is a square. So it's really important to get the setting of K correct, or possibly average over many K values, depending on your application. So that's essentially all there is to K-nearest neighbors, and just like all the other methods we learned, this is an example with only 2 inputs, but you could imagine 1,000 inputs and it would be the same concept, but on a 1,000 axis plot rather than a 2-axis plot as we see here. Hard to visualize, but easy to figure out via math. So that's K-nearest neighbors classification for you.